is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. Welcome to the Exit Readiness Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Walter Dial, CPA and tax partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors here in Bethesda, Maryland. Our mission here on the podcast is to provide you, the business owner, with subject matter expertise on topics pertaining to building sellable business value and planning for your eventual exit from the business. We want to help you build a business that's sellable or transferable and then exit successfully on your own terms and conditions. As a small business owner, you've experienced over the last number of months unprecedented challenges due to the crisis, none of which have been more challenging probably than making decisions pertaining to your employees. And now that things are beginning to open up again, you're still faced with questions pertaining to things like, can I, as an employer, require my employees to return? What factors should be considered in addition to legal requirements in deciding whether employees return to work? Are there things that should be considered in managing employees remotely? And so we want to help you with these, with the answers to these questions and others today. With our topic, return to work issues, where we were, where we are, and where we're going.
Pat, today our guest today is employment attorney Marc Engel of Lerch, and Brewer here in Bethesda, Maryland. Marc's becoming a regular guest here on the podcast, and we're happy to have him back with us today. Marc, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Marc, depending on how you count, we're now 5, maybe 6 months into the pandemic. Where do things stand in terms of employees returning to work? And I know it's somewhat geographically based, so you can tell us what's going on in Maryland. That's fine, or even Montgomery County.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, the answer is it sort of depends to some extent. We've got a little bit of a mix match in terms of employees coming back to work, depending upon the jurisdiction, as you mentioned, whether they're in Montgomery County, whether they're in the district, or whether they're in Virginia, or whether they're in other parts of Maryland. And what I'm seeing in general, and these are some general themes, you see employers, slowly starting to bring employees back to work. Some have already done so for sure, and others are sort of increasing that ramp up, so to speak. Most, in my experience, are doing so on a gradual basis, on a stage basis, on a phased basis, if you will, so that they're complying with state and local laws that exist, which are fluid and changing, complying with CDC requirements, and complying with best practices. It also depends upon the nature of the work and the nature of the business. For businesses where there are more essential workers needed, obviously more of those folks are coming back to work and have been back to work for quite a while. Office workers, on the other hand, with the exception of a core group for, say, professional service firms, accounting firms, law firms, and so forth. What I'm seeing is that expansion of the core group from a handful of employees to some of the non-administrative, non-core employees who are comfortable to one degree or another coming back to work.
Yeah. So, hey, Marc, I know this is a question that not a few employees or employers, business owners have, and that is, do employees actually have a right to work remotely?
Again, the answer is in certain instances, yes. Under the American with Disabilities Act and related sort of state and local statutes, if someone has a disability, working remotely can be a form of an accommodation. And the analysis there, Pat, is really, if you look at it as a continuum, okay? When does accommodating an employee become an undue hardship? Sort of the sliding scale, if you will. That's sort of the paradigm that I typically operate under. It's changed with COVID for sure. Increasingly, my clients, and I'm advising clients to be, pretty judicious, pretty careful about, forcing employees to come back to work who are uncomfortable in doing so. They may be uncomfortable because they have a health condition, an underlying health condition. They may be uncomfortable because they have a family member as such, where they've been exposed to someone. So again, some of the rules and good practices in terms of when people can return to work, I think overall, in answer to your question, those have been relaxed. And particularly so, if I could put a fine point on it, where there's been a situation where someone has been potentially exposed to COVID. Okay. And then you have state and local and CDC requirements that kick in, right, about how long someone either has to be asymptomatic, whether they need to have a test, and whether there's going to be protocols in place for returning to the workplace.
So, Mark, do employers, let me just give you an example. Let's just say you have an employee who doesn't have any underlying conditions, but is just very freaked out by the whole COVID thing and refuses to return to the office. Is there any point where the employer has the right to say, you know what, I need to replace you with someone who's willing to come in?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Walter. I think the analysis would be, is that individual really essential to the operations of the employer? And that's going to be a function of what the nature of the business is, what that person does on a day-to-day basis, what others can do to kind of backfill that position. So assuming that there's no medical need, there's no reason for an accommodation why the person needs to stay home, there's been no exposure, the protocols are in place at the office or the place of work, the client may be requiring it, for example. Yes, if all those boxes get checked, the employer can begin to require employees to come back to work. Again, it's the flip side of the question that Pat asked, which is, I'm going to be very judicious and very cautious about making that judgment call. I'm going to try to see if there's a way to, understand what the employee's concerns are. It may be, for example, some of this may be educational. It may be that the employee does not fully understand what the employer has done in terms of best practices in the office. The employee may not appreciate how many employees are back. Is social distancing being monitored? Is PPE there? Is there hand sanitizer? So some of the anxiety, which is very understandable, can be diffused, through knowledge, right?
Yeah.
If not, then it's usually what I really, suggest and recommend strong is having a discussion to try to come up with a pathway back that makes sense for both sides. So people don't feel like they're being compelled to return.
Yeah. And are the various safe, like for instance, in our office, I know we've put a kind of a plastic shield around the receptionist desk and we blocked off every other cubicle and things like this. The kitchen is pretty much off limits. Are these rules or are these we're just doing it for best practices?
Well, if you had asked me this a number of weeks back, I would say largely it's best practices, but increasingly you have requirements, in Montgomery County and otherwise about what the expectations are for what the workplace should be doing, right? So those need to be followed. Virginia recently passed its own kind of what at the time, and I think it's still the case, first of its kind of a workplace safety piece of legislation that went into effect on July 27th. And applies to various employers based upon their size, and essentially requires those employers, depending if they're in an environment which is considered very high, medium, or low risk, to take certain steps to safeguard the workplace. And that those requirements essentially track the CDC guidelines, and in some instances they go a little bit further. So that is placing an affirmative obligation on employers to go ahead and put those measures in place.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's also interesting that a lot of the things we're doing are more or less now going to be permanent additions to the office. I don't, once we've installed everything, I'm not sure, if we're going to pay somebody to come in and undo it. Plus, there could be, another pandemic or anything else. So who knows?
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think this is going to become, to some degree or another, the new normal in terms of safety in the office. The other thing is, at a federal level, the OSHA laws in general require employers to provide a safe place. One of my partners wrote a very interesting article about liability issues. When can employers have liability for not providing a safe workplace? And most folks, including me to some degree, would think, okay, if somebody could show that they got COVID in the workplace, it's likely a workers' comp issue, right? Somebody slips and falls, they trip. But it's not so clear when it comes to COVID. And basically the analysis there is that the employer would have to show in order to get the benefit of the workers' comp bar, that this kind of work was really part and parcel of the risk that the employee assumed. And so, for example, first providers, right, and other healthcare professionals where it's really intrinsic to what they do, to being subjected to, getting in close proximity and so forth. That's part of what they do on a day-to-day basis, and that would likely fall within the workers' comp. However, Walter, for folks like us who are working in the office, being exposed to people is not usually in our job description, and therefore the workers' comp application may not apply. So what does that mean? A long-winded way of saying is that employers could be liable theoretically in negligence for not taking the appropriate steps to, safeguard the office.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, Mark, of course, there are these laws, orders, regulations that you hit on here in the last couple of minutes that need to be considered, and we're going to recommend to listeners that they contact you or whoever their employment lawyer is to review these laws and regulations. But what else besides the legislative requirements needs to be considered as to when and whether an employer brings employees back to work?
Again, an excellent question. So let me just backfill a little bit of my prior response about the legislative orders and the statutes, because there's one point I wanted to emphasize, which is the District of Columbia, for example, and various states throughout the country are now having ordinances and laws passed where if you have been in a so-called hotspot, okay, you have to self-quarantine for 14 days or a suitable period of time. The District of Columbia just issued one in the past 10 days or so. And so, and I believe Maryland has issued something similar, if I'm not mistaken, recently. But again, that's more and more the states are going towards that. So if people are traveling, right, for pleasure, they're going on vacation, particularly during the summer, they need to be reminded that when they come back, they may not be able to come back to the office right away. So, in answer to your question, the other requirements besides the legislative requirements and the other considerations really go to the essence of the job. Okay, and in number one, number two, the employee and his or her ability to work remotely successfully. Number three, whether the computer systems, the technology is set up to work successfully remotely. Number four, client and customer expectations. For government contractors, for example, we represent a number of government contractors. There are issues and concerns about when and under what circumstances folks can work remotely, and whether there's a process in place for managing remote work and doing so successfully. So again, the challenge of managing employees is always there in my view, but it really has become a new kind of responsibility and a new kind of challenge in the COVID world that didn't exist previously. And so what I'm advising clients who, as to Walter's point, are otherwise healthy enough to return or to stay at home, is to undertake that analysis on a case-by-case basis. What is the person doing? Okay. Can they do it successfully remotely? And how do we measure that success? Do we have, deliverables? Do we have regular call-ins? Do we have deadlines and so forth? And are we tracking that to see if that's successful? Are the communication systems in place? And do we have a way of continuing to measure job performance on a going forward basis? I think when you look at all those factors, and then you take into account, obviously, the concerns, very understandable concerns that employees have about returning to work, I think you can come up with a practice that really makes sense. The other thing that's critically important for employees that are returning to work, particularly if they've been exposed, okay, or they've self-quarantined, there needs to be a gatekeeper, okay, whether it's the head of HR, whether it's an executive, so that people are just not returning to work without the senior management team knowing about it. For example, at our firm, and Walter's may be similar, we need to do a daily attestation, which is a form that I use with clients where I literally have to certify every day that 6 or 7 questions that I don't have COVID symptoms. and it's done as an email. It pops up, and it's kind of my ticket to get into the office. If I don't do it, then I'm not being accountable to my colleagues, and I could be asked to leave the office.
So that role of gatekeeper that you just mentioned would be the person that would own that piece, just making sure that happens throughout the organization?
Correct. So that would, in our instance, it goes to our COO and I think our HR director, right? That ends up getting relayed to our somebody who's been sitting at the receptionist desk. So there's a score sheet, if you will, of folks who are in the office that day. It's comforting to our colleagues to know who's there, right? Number one. And number two, if heaven forbid we had somebody get exposed, or became symptomatic, we had been in the office, we could do the contact tracing by knowing who was here. But
yeah, it's interesting, Mark. We're not allowing visitors into the office yet, but
right.
We anticipate when we do, they'll have to fill out a similar attestation to get in.
Yeah, and we're using that as well, right?
Yeah.
So same sort of thought process there. But even when I'll come in sometimes at night, I'm coming in at the weekends. I'm still filling out the attestation because I don't want someone. If I'm at the copy machine, is not expecting to see me. It may be somewhat unnerving. And also for the contact tracing pieces.
Mark, can employees be held to the same standards when they're working remotely as if they were actually on site?
Yes, the answer is yes, and it's but setting the standards is really important. What I'm advising clients, and I'm working with clients, so to kind of take a fresh look at their job descriptions, to make sure that dust those things off. They may not even be current or applicable anymore, but probably not so in the COVID world where people are working remotely. So if somebody had 10 things that they were responsible for, but now in the COVID world, they're working remotely, their job has changed a little bit. Now it's 5 key things. You want to make sure folks are on the same page about what the expectations are. And then you have to measure the performance against those expectations and those job duties, because the next wave of cases, which is already starting to happen, are the claims that somebody who is terminated or laid off during this COVID situation is being discriminated against or treated wrongfully because they didn't return to the office, or they had a health issue or some other issue. If the employer's defense to that is, no, the business reason why we had to move in another direction was because you weren't getting your job done, right? Then the employer needs to be able to establish that in a very thoughtful way, so that, hey, no, these were the metrics, these were the deliverables, this is where things fell short. So again, yes, they can be held to the same standard, but with a bit of an asterisk. I've got a situation now in the office where we've got a couple of underperforming employees for a client, and the issue is, could we move to terminate? And what I'm generally advising clients, except if it's more of an extreme situation, is to let's look at this a little bit more. Let's move the wide angle lens out a little bit, and let's understand fully, hey, we're in COVID. Okay, why did the performance fall off? Are there mitigating factors? Does the employer have some potential, contribution to this because we didn't communicate very well? To look at this maybe a little bit with a little bit more of a tapping of the brakes before moving as quickly to termination.
Okay, and you just mentioned a great action item. It's always a good action item, isn't it, to dust off the job descriptions? How about some others? Are there some other actionable items that you can give our listeners here that they can take in the next few weeks that could dramatically impact or improve their return to work process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really one of those areas where if employers, almost regardless of size, take a handful of measures to get ahead of the curve on these issues, it's going to be incredibly beneficial, both in terms of saving time, administrative time, cost, potential liability issues. So let me go through those quickly. And they're also in an article that I've written, which I'm happy to share with your listeners. But in no specific order, as to Walter's point, certainly having the daily attestation form for employees who are coming in, having ready to go a visitor survey form because when we're going to get there soon enough, and for some clients maybe already are there. Okay. Number 3, having kind of a workplace sort of protocol policy, which basically says, here are the rules of the road for how we're doing things in the office from a COVID perspective. Here's the measures that we've taken. Here's the best practices we've taken in terms of the office layout, the PPE, the masks, the hand sanitizers and so forth. Here's what should happen if we have an exposure, what we're going to do. Here's what our expectations are. If you're self-quarantining or returning to the office, it has a section there on the gatekeeper coming back. So you have a workplace protocol policy. Let's all be singing off the same sheet of music. 4th would be having a remote work plan, okay, or policy. To again manage the expectations and really make it clear, among other things, that remote work is by and large not an entitlement. It's still pretty much a privilege, right? A 5th would be having, for employers that are subject to it, which is going to be most, an emergency family medical leave and emergency pay leave policy, which complies with the Federal Coronavirus Response Act, which is destined right now to sunset at the end of December, but it's a special type of leave that's available for COVID-related incidents, would be a 6th thing that I'd recommend. And then certainly, as you mentioned, dusting off and updating the job descriptions. And I think the last thing would really be sitting down with the managers, spending 30 minutes, 45 minutes, training managers how to effectively manage employees. I'm doing that kind of work for clients right now. One of the sort of inside baseball, because I know you're a huge fan, Joe, and Walter as well, I'm sure, issues that I see is managers just reluctant to put their hand up and ask for help because they don't want to seem foolish. So they're not going to, their colleagues are not going to senior management and saying, hey, how do I manage this employee? How should I handle this situation? Because they don't want to seem like they don't know what they're doing. And once that sets in, that mindset, it's a prescription for a lot of unnecessary issues. So if you take those measures, and then last but not least, importantly, and put an asterisk next to this, take a look at your insurance policies. Speak to your agent, speak to your broker. Are we covered, soup to nuts, for COVID-related issues? If I get hit with a wrongful termination claim, if I have data that's being lost because somebody's working remotely, if I have somebody who makes a claim that they contracted COVID in the workplace, right? If I have an accommodation claim because somebody didn't accommodate me, am I covered? And the answer may be yes, but the answer may be, you know what, we need to look into that a little bit further and see if there's any other coverages that can be added.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Mark, let me ask you a question that we may decide to not include in the podcast, but just struck me. I'm kind of curious. See what your thoughts are on this. If you're an employee whose compensation is largely incentive-based,
right,
and now you're kind of hosed, not because of anything you did wrong, you're just left to the graces of the employer, right? You don't have any rights to say, well, I couldn't meet my target because all my clients were shut down for 4 months.
That's a really good question at a couple different levels, which let me address it at that level first. And then I think there's a couple questions that kind of flow from that, Walter. But in general, the answer is from an employer's perspective is to some degree, yes. The employee is a little bit out of luck on that. If the employee is at will, okay, and there's no contract that says I'm going to get a certain, base against commission, or which can be baked into some relationships. And as long as they're getting minimum wage, okay, for their time, if they're not getting the bonus compensation, the commission compensation, that's kind of a vagary of the world we're in to some degree, right? What I see with clients is they're looking fresh at their compensation systems. They're reducing hours, and to some degree for an exchange and a reduction in pay, right? Some are, changing schedules. Okay, some are taking and having compensation that's heavily incentive comp and moving that into more of a base comp with less incentive. So again, folks are sort of looking at that in a number of different ways to try to address the new reality that we have. Importantly, in Maryland in particular, if an employer is going to go ahead and reduce the wages of an employee, by law, you need to give at least one pay period's notice before you do that. But the caveat here, and this is a really important question, there had been in years past, and up until the COVID hit, a fair amount of litigation, particularly in Maryland, on when is a bonus or commission earned and when is it due, which is a larger discussion which we could talk about for half an hour. But the long and short of it is that the siren call from these cases is for employers to be very clear about when a bonus or commission is earned and what needs to be done to earn it and how it's going to be handled if an individual leaves employment for any reason.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So as we close, Mark, are any other key things that we haven't asked about? I mean, it seems like we've been pretty thorough and you've done a fantastic job, but can you think of anything that we failed to ask you about?
Well, thank you. I think there's just no, I can't overemphasize the importance of communication, particularly, with staff, with people who are working remotely. These are extraordinary times. Obviously, the employee anxiety levels quite not like anything that I've ever seen. There's a very interesting article in the Washington Post on Sunday, if you saw it, about the anxiety and the stress that this is causing to employees and sort of the so-called brain fog that folks are having in terms of functioning. The challenges to focus in what you do on a day-to-day basis have never been harder. Okay. So I think employers doing several things. One, checking in with their remote people regularly, right? The communication is really important. For the leaders of organizations, expressing praise and gratitude for the work that people are doing, checking in to see how they're doing, communicating about work assignments regularly, having regular meetings and discussions with your supervisors, weekly check-ins or every other week at least, who are managing staff. Hey, what's working, what's not working? Okay, what do we need to do different? If an employee is falling behind in terms of work, okay, don't kick that can down the road. Address that issue early, and be consistent in how you're applying your policies and procedures. I think are all good steps to be taken.
Yeah, those are all great points. So final two questions. Anything you'd like to promote today? And please tell our listeners how they can reach you.
Sure. My colleagues have done a wonderful job of creating content, writing articles. I've written a number of them myself on employment-related issues, business issues, litigation issues related to COVID, which is on our website. We have a COVID center at www.lerchearly.com, which my colleagues have done an excellent job doing a lot of work with PPP loans, for example, on the lending side. And I would encourage folks to visit that website because my colleagues, as I said, have done an excellent job, spent hours and dozens of hours putting together content that people can access and use in a very, what we think is an easy and effective way. For folks who want to contact me, I'm actually in the office a little bit more than I had been. I'm one of the phased-in folks, or at least chosen to be at this point. At 301-657-0184 is my work number, and my cell is 301-509-2023.
Fantastic. And thanks again, Mark, for joining us. This has been really, really informative. I'm sure our listeners are really going to benefit, and I know Pat and I have as well.
My pleasure.
Listeners, thank you. Listeners, if you want help in maximizing the value of your business or planning for your eventual exit, you can reach Pat at 301-859-0860, and you can reach me at 301-951-9090. You can also access resources at exitreadiness.com, grfcpa.com, and nslp.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time on the Exit Readiness Podcast, this is Walter Dial and Pat Ennis signing off.